Hello everybody, I think it's time to get started. This is the second Friday seminar organized by the Center for Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies in cooperation with the New Middle East project. We're very happy to have Dr Joas Wagemakers here today. He's going to speak on a very, very interesting topic. Joas is an assistant professor and a postdoctoral research fellow of Islamic Studies at Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. He has published widely in a number of journals and edited volumes on Salafism and Islamism. His production is really very, very impressive, and you get very envious when you see the long publication list he has in a very short time. But so much for my feelings of envy for people who are so productive. Anyway, but he's perhaps most known for his book on Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, who is a towering, very important figure in the Salafi Jihadi movement, a very, very important ideologue. So he has written quietist Jihadi, the ideology and influence of Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, published by Cambridge University Press in 2012. His current research focus is on quietist Salafism and the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, but he has done research on Jihadi-Salafism in the past, and also extensive field work. He also has co-edits Zemzem, a Dutch language journal on the Middle East, North Africa and Islam, and he also blogs at Jihadi-Salafis.com. But also you are interested in jihadi issues, visit Jihadi-Salafis.com. Very, very good blog on those issues. So without any further ado, please go on.
Thank you, Brynja, for that kind introduction. I hope you understand that after such an introduction, everything I'm going to say is going to be a complete anticlimax and an utter disappointment. But I hope I can still keep you from falling asleep. I'm going to be speaking about several things. I'm going to give you an overview first. First of all, religious authority in dispute. What is religious authority in Islam? Secondly, the Khawarij versus the Murji'a. I can imagine that you've heard of the first, you may not have heard of the second one, and if you've heard of neither, no problem, because I'm going to explain it to you. The Jordanian Salafi movement, who are they, and what are the most important people, and how quietist Salafis dispute religious authority. Salafis in general are the people that I define as the Sunni Muslims who look at the Prophet Muhammad and the first three generations of Islam and try to emulate those first three generations of Islam as strictly and as widely and in as many spheres of life as possible. That's what I see Salafis as being. And how Jihadi-Salafis are involved in this. Jihadi-Salafis, in my definition, are those Salafis who believe that jihad is not just a means to expand the abode of Islam or to defend it against external aggression, but who also believe that jihad can properly be used within the abode of Islam, within what is called in Arabic Dar al-Islam, to overthrow what they see as the apostate rulers of the Muslim world. So rulers who call themselves Muslims but who really aren't in their perception. And how Jordanian Salafis, Jordanian Jihadi-Salafis contest religious authority amongst themselves. Right. First of all, religious authority. What is that in Islam? Religious authority, and some of you may be Roman Catholics, for example, and obviously all of you know that in Roman Catholicism there is such a person as the Pope. It's very clear he is the head of the church, and if you want to know what the doctrine of the church is, then it flows down from the Vatican. That's quite understandable. There's a clear hierarchy. In Islam, this is slightly different, at least in Sunni Islam. Sunni Islam is very decentralized. There is no Islamic Pope. In Shiite Islam, it's slightly different, but in Sunni Islam, at least, it's very decentralized, and it's based on intangible factors. You can't say, well, I studied at this university, or I have such and such a certificate, so that makes me a great religious authority. No, it's based on several intangible factors. It might have to do with things like charisma, being a good speaker, being very knowledgeable, obviously. But it may have to, what is very knowledgeable? It's difficult to define that exactly. So religious authority in Islam is very difficult to quantify and very difficult to describe. We noticed this, of course, after 9/11, because there were people in the West who said, well, isn't there someone in the Muslim world who can condemn all of this? Well, obviously there were lots of people in the Muslim world condemning all of this, but there was no single pope. I mean, he doesn't exist, so obviously he can't condemn that. So what makes one a religious authority? Well, according to Quentin Wiktorowicz, who's written an article about this and also a book about called Radical Islam Rising, which was about the Al-Muhajirun movement in London, or broadly speaking in England, he said there are basically three main characteristics of religious authority in Islamic movements. One is having the right knowledge. What does that mean, having the right knowledge? It means saying the right things, being doctrinally sound, so not stating the wrong beliefs, as it were. Secondly, he said it's having the right character. Now, what did he mean by that? It meant, for example, in the case of his publication on Al-Muhajirun, the man he was focusing on, Umar Bakri Muhammad, who was a leader of Al-Muhajirun in London, was a man fulminating against the British state. And he said, you know, Britain is an infidel country, you shouldn't have anything to do with its government. But at the same time, he was withdrawing unemployment benefit from that same state. So it was seen as slightly contradictory that the man who was criticizing the British state was willing to accept its money because he couldn't work for health reasons. So that was damaging to his character. If you are an upright, upstanding citizen and of good moral character, that obviously is good for you. And personality-wise as well. If you're a nice person, if you're good with people, you know, if you're good at handling relations with people, if you are a friendly person, if you're a good speaker, if you're charismatic, all of these things matter in religious authority. So how does one dispute other people's religious authority? Well, one way to do that is to exalt one's own religious authority, to speak highly of one's own religious authority, or better still, to have other people speak highly of your religious authority. It obviously means more when somebody else says, oh, he's a great scholar, you can really trust him, than when you say, I am a great scholar, you can really trust me. So exalting one's own religious authority or having other people do that is obviously a great way to achieve religious authority. And this happens all the time. Many people who want to establish their own credentials as a scholar add the comments of other scholars. This is what other people have said about me. And then these other people are obviously great scholars in their own right. The flip side of that is the vilification of another person's authority. And this is what we're going to be talking about. This has to do with name-calling, with labeling people. For example, I'm from the Netherlands, and one way to really discredit someone is to call someone a Nazi, for example. I mean, nobody wants to deal with the Nazis. Everybody agrees Nazis, those are bad people. Actually, we were passing a street sign yesterday, Brynjar and I, and it said NSB. You know, it stands for the railway tracks. In the Netherlands, NSB stands for a Dutch group that collaborated with the Nazis during the war. If you are called a member of the NSB in the Netherlands, that's not a compliment at all. So that will be a very strong way, and I presume that something similar exists here in Norway. A very strong way, an effective way to vilify other people and to de-credentialize other people's authority. Now this presentation is going to be about how Salafis in Jordan do that, how they try to dispute each other's religious authority. Now just remember that for a moment, just put that to the side. Now we're going to delve into Islamic history a bit, and then I'll tie the two up. First of all, the Khawarij and the Murji'a. The Khawarij and the Murji'a both have their origins, their historical origins, at the Battle of Siffin in the year 657. As all of you know, the Caliph at that time was Ali ibn Abi Talib. I was joking, I'm not presuming that all of you know that. But he was fighting a battle in 657 against Muawiyah, which actually means bitch in Arabic. There was a tendency at that time among Arabs to name their children after, well, things that may not be very positive. And these two were having a battle, and Muawiyah was losing. Ali ibn Abi Talib, the caliph at the time, the fourth rightly guided successor to Muhammad, was asked by his opponents, can we mediate? Because I'm losing this battle and we shouldn't fight anymore, can we mediate? And Ali ibn Abi Talib accepted that. There is actually a story that the fighters of Muawiyah put out their spears and stuck copies of the Quran on the tips of the spears to suggest we want to mediate on the basis of the Quran. Because Ali accepted this, there was a small group of his supporters who said, no, you should not have accepted that. What you should have done is fight on, because you are the rightful leader of this community, and the fact that you are willing to compromise that by accepting mediation with another group that is opposed to you, that was willing to fight you to the death, means that you are no longer the righteous leader, and we are going to leave your community. And to leave or to move out in Arabic is kharaja, and from that word, the word Khawarij is derived. So what does that mean? It means something like seceders, or those people who leave in Arabic. So they left the community. There was also another group in the same conflict who said, no, we mustn't pass judgment over this. We mustn't be too quick to judge what is going on here. So they said, it's better for us to delay or to postpone judgment. The word postpone, the verb postpone in Arabic is arja'a yurji'u, and from that the word murji'a was derived. They also gave it a Quranic legitimization later on, but this is the origin of the term. So murji'a can be translated as postponers, or people who delay things. They had several points of view, because these points of view, theological and political points of view, grew out of this original division between these groups. First was in relation with the rulers. The Khawarij rebelled against rulers. In fact, the caliph I just referred to, Ali ibn Abi Talib, was murdered by one of the Khawarij. And the Murji'a mostly, not always, but mostly submitted to the rulers. So they were subservient, more subservient, and sometimes seen as sort of as lackeys, people who were willing to accept everything from the rulers. This was not always justified, because, as I said, they did not always submit to the rulers. And finally, the Khawarij and the Murji'a also had certain theological positions that underpinned their political positions. And these had to do with faith and with unbelief. Faith in Arabic is iman, and unbelief is kufr. Kufr is actually derived from a word which means to be ungrateful. Kafara means to be ungrateful, but it quickly took on the meaning of being ungrateful towards the mercy and the blessings of God. In other words, to reject God. In other words, to be an unbeliever. And I'm going to get slightly technical here, but there are, in Salafis, distinguish three different levels of faith. They distinguish sahhat ad-din, which is the sort of the thing that you need most. If you don't have that, you don't have faith. You have the wajib ad-din, which is necessary for your faith to be whole, and the kamal ad-din, which is necessary for faith to be completed, which perfects your faith. But if you don't have that, it's not a problem. But if you do have it, it's added to the other things. It's slightly more complicated than I can point out right now, because I actually want to talk about a situation in which this matters less than it seems to be. It seems to do at first sight. But the Khawarij were willing to call people unbelievers if they committed sins that took place on that second middle level of faith. So to give you an example, if a Muslim drinks a glass of wine, Khawarij were willing to say, you are an unbeliever, simply because of that act. The more or less orthodox position of Islam on that is, yes, you are an unbeliever if you declare that drinking wine is legitimate, or if you do that out of conviction. There are obviously Muslims who drink wine, but they may say, well, I know it's not allowed, but I do it anyway because I like wine. That's different, according to Islamic doctrine, from saying I drink wine because I am convinced that it's the right thing to do. In Arabic, this is called bil-i'tiqad, with conviction, al-istihlal, making something halal, making something allowed that is actually haram, that is actually forbidden, or doing something by juhd, by actually refuting or negating the truth of Islam. That is more serious. Whereas Orthodox Muslims say, okay, this is a necessary precondition for someone to be called a kafir, for someone to be called an unbeliever, The Khawarij said, no, the act in itself, major sins, kaba'ir, are enough reason to call someone an unbeliever. The Murji'a went the other way around. They said, no, we are going to postpone judgment even on people who commit kufr. So even on people who are doing acts of unbelief. So if there is a person, in theory of course, who would bow down to an actual idol, so let's say a statue of Buddha or something like that, if there is a Muslim who would actually bow down to that statue, and who would say, no, but I'm still a Muslim, the Murji'a would say, okay, we're not going to call you a non-Muslim. We'll leave this to God. We're going to postpone judgment about this situation to God. Just to point this out, the Murji'a were not lax Muslims. They were not less pious than other Muslims. It's just that they were willing to postpone judgment here on earth and leave God to decide about that. So I hope that this is clear, that we have different positions on faith, and that the Khawarij and the Murji'a represented two different extremes, one on the one end and the other on the other end. Now, how does this relate to the Jordanian Salafi movement? First of all, let me introduce the main characters. I've sort of limited it to 4 names. I understand it's difficult for you to remember all these names, so I've tried to limit myself to 4 names. More people were involved, but I hope you'll remember these. The first is a man called Muhammad Nasir ad-Din al-Albani. As you can tell from his name, he's originally Albanian, but he moved to Syria when he was a child, and he ended up in Jordan and spent the last, say, 18, 20 years of his life there. Yeah, about 18. He was basically the leader of the Salafis in Jordan until his death in 1999. And he's still really a towering figure in Jordan even now. If Jordanian Salafis refer to the Sheikh, it's always clear who they mean. They mean Al-Albani. It's like, I mean, there are various composers called Bach, but if you talk about Bach, you always mean Johann Sebastian. I don't know if he would be happy if I compare him to Bach, but I certainly see it as a compliment. And he settled in Jordan in the early 1980s, so 18 years in Jordan. The second person that is of interest is a student of his called Ali al-Halabi. He is of Palestinian origin, and he's lived in Jordan, I think, most of his life. I think he was a refugee who came in 1948, but perhaps in 1967, I'm not quite sure. But anyway, he's of Palestinian descent. He is basically the current leader of Jordanian quietist Salafis, so those Salafis who do not get involved in politics. He's still alive. I've talked to him several times. Then there is a man called Muhammad Ibrahim Shaqra. He's an elderly man. I think he's in his 80s. He's also not very healthy. I think he's rather gravely ill. He was one of the first Salafis in Jordan. He was really one of the founders of the Salafi movement in Jordan. And he was very important, not just because he was one of the first Salafis in Jordan, but also because he brought Al-Albani to Jordan in the 1970s. He once went to Syria, met Al-Albani, and thought to himself, this is a great man, we really need to hear from him in Jordan. So he took Al-Albani to Jordan, and the rest, as they say, is history. But nowadays he's very much ostracized and marginalized by the rest of the Salafi movement. And we're going to talk about why that is happening later on. Is it because of theological reasons? Is it because of the different arguments about faith and unbelief that I talked about just now? Or are there different reasons? I'm going to argue that the theology does play a role, but that there is actually something else behind it that you cannot find in the publications. But if you talk to the people involved, and I've talked to all of the people involved except for Al-Albani, who died obviously years ago, then you notice that there is something else going on, something much less lofty and theological, much more human. And the final one is Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi. As Bringa said, I've written a book about this man. He is basically the leader of the Jihadi-Salafis in Jordan. He's one of the most important Jihadi-Salafi ideologues in the world, if not the most important. And he has also been criticized, just like Shaqra and just like Al-Halabi and just like Al-Albani as well. Is that for reasons of theology? Partly, but there is also something else going on. So what I'm trying to do here is not only show you how religious authority in Jordan among Salafis is disputed, but also what is behind it. And this is, I think, interesting. Right. So, how do they dispute one another? Ali al-Halabi, I hope you remember his name, he wrote a book called At-Tahdhir min Fitnat Takfir, which means something like the warning of the chaos or the strife of declaring other people non-Muslims. Takfir is to declare someone an unbeliever. That book was not a book that he actually wrote himself. It was based on a fatwa by Al-Albani. It was published in 1996 when Al-Albani was still alive, and it was said to criticize takfir, so excommunication, declaring someone to be an infidel, in itself. So he took a notion in Islam, takfir, and he didn't say, well, the notion itself is good, it's just that we shouldn't go to extremes. No. He criticized the term itself. And he was heavily criticized for that by a man, okay, I'm going to introduce one more name, but he's not really that important, so you can forget about him. By a man called Muhammad Abu Ruhayyim. Muhammad Abu Ruhayyim, I interviewed him as well. He's still angry over this situation. He was really shouting at me, not because he was angry with me, but really because he was angry with the situation. He was so angry, in fact, that he didn't want to mention Al-Halabi's name. He kept referring to him as this man, which was pretty confusing to me, because I said, who do you mean? Well, this man. Al-Albani? No, this man. Makes it difficult sometimes. But I figured it out in the end. He criticized this book. He really took issue with it. And he's also a long-time Salafi. He was one of the first Salafis in Jordan as well. He's also, I think, in his 60s right now. And he criticized Al-Albani's fatwa on which that book was based for his views on faith. And by doing so, he broke a taboo. Because Al-Albani, as I said, was the sheikh. He was the man that Salafis all looked up to. And if you start criticizing Al-Albani for his views on faith, that is breaking a taboo. But he did so in very hushed tones. He did so in a very civilized way. But when Ali al-Halabi published that book based on that fatwa, what Muhammad Abu Ruhayyim did was he took the book and he sent it to a council called the Permanent Council. In Arabic it's actually Al-Lajna Ad-Da'ima Lil-Buhuth Al-Ilmiyya Wal-Ifta', which means the Permanent Council for knowledge studies, studies concerning Islamic knowledge, and fatwas. And he asked them, he said, this is a book I would like you to read and pass judgment on it. And the Permanent Council gave a fatwa and said, this book by Ali al-Halabi contains traces of irja'. It's a Murji'i book. In other words, this book was written by someone who belongs to the Murji'a, so to one of those groups of early Islam that I just mentioned.
This council, who is behind the council?
The council is, that's a good question. I should have mentioned that. The council is actually made up of major scholars, major Saudi scholars, some of the top scholars in Saudi Arabia. So what if this council says there's something wrong with your book, then you have to be a very firm and strong scholar to be able to reject that. So he sent the book there, and the book was heavily criticized for it. Now, Muhammad Ibrahim Shaqra, one of the earliest Salafis in Jordan, was ostracized for his theological views on faith. And he sided with Muhammad Abu Ruhayyim in this debate. Muhammad Ibrahim Shaqra, in deciding who was right, Ali al-Halabi with his book on faith, or Muhammad Abu Ruhayyim with his criticism of this book, said, I'm going to side with Muhammad Abu Ruhayyim, so with the man criticizing that book. And by doing so, he implicitly also criticized Al-Albani, on whose fatwa that book was based. Now, in the secondary literature that you will find on this subject, you will find that the reason for the breakup between these different Salafis, between, on the one hand, Muhammad Ibrahim Shaqra, and on the other hand, Ali al-Halabi, was because of this issue. They say there's a theological reason for the breakup. Ali al-Halabi took one theological position, and Muhammad Ibrahim Shaqra took another theological position. And they disagreed with one another, and that's why they split. I think there is something else going on, and that's what I'm going to talk about right now. Muhammad Ibrahim Shaqra, as I said, is now in his 80s, and he had great knowledge. He was an Azhar-educated scholar. He went to Al-Azhar University in Egypt, which is one of the most reputable universities in the world, in the Muslim world anyway. And he was a long-time Salafi, so he had the Salafi pedigree, as it were. And in that sense, he had great religious authority. At the same time, however, he had a daytime job as a civil servant. And he was rubbing elbows with princes and with the king, and he had very good relations with them. But because he actually had a job, he didn't have much time to keep on studying and to keep on writing and to keep on reading. Which meant that despite the fact that he was a great scholar in his early years, his relative scholarly credentials went down and down and down because he had a normal job and he wasn't a full-time scholar. And he sought the leadership of the Salafi community when Al-Albani died. He said, I am one of the first Salafis here in this country, I am the most senior of age, I brought Al-Albani here, I have a good scholarly education, I studied at Al-Azhar, so I should really be the leader. And I talked to this man as well, and really he stressed that I was the one who brought Al-Albani to Jordan. I was the one who started Salafism. He stressed his own role. And also his son has written a book to defend his father, and he does that as well. It was my father who did this. It was my father who brought Al-Albani here. So there's very much an emphasis in certain pages of that book on the personal role that this man has played in establishing and developing the Salafi movement in Jordan. Not about theology. If we look at Ali al-Halabi, he has no formal education. Each and every one of you is higher educated than he is, because I presume you all finished high school and you're all at university. He was relatively young, so particularly in a society where seniority of age is something very important, that was a drawback. But he was very close to young Salafis. Like them, he was a Palestinian refugee from the camps, and he could talk to them in a way that they understood because he was young like them as well. And he slowly but surely became the most knowledgeable scholar. Brynjar just praised my productivity as an academic, and I thank him for it. But my productivity as a scholar pales in comparison to that of Ali al-Halabi, who has written over 200 books. I've written two. Well, I still have a long way to go, right? Some of them are just small booklets, but nevertheless he's an extremely productive man and an extremely knowledgeable man, and he was a full-time scholar, so he could spend all his time dedicating it to scholarly pursuits. And he also sought the Salafi leadership after Al-Albani's death, and he had his own credentials. So this divided the Salafi camp, and Shaqra was ostracized over this leadership issue because he saw himself as an heir to Al-Albani. He saw himself as the most likely successor to all of this. And the fact that Salafis did not choose him but chose Ali al-Halabi because he was more knowledgeable and because he was younger and he was more charismatic, and he was one of them, as it were, frustrated him personally. And because of this frustration over the leadership, they started using the theological dispute that they had, which was real, which existed, but they started using that as a front to cover up the real leadership issue. Obviously, I think it's very obvious to all of us that it sounds much more scholarly to say, well, I don't want to have anything to do with them because they have deviant religious views. That sounds much more scholarly than to say, well, I don't want to have anything to do with them because they don't want to have anything to do with me. They don't want me as their leader. Shaqra is one of those Salafis who is really frustrated right now in Jordan because he was rejected as the leader, and he really wanted that so badly. This leadership contest took on a theological guise because they used the theological arguments to dispute one another's religious authority, turning it into a dispute that was supposedly all about theology. But the underlying dispute was really about the leadership. I mean, Al-Albani held similar views to Ali al-Halabi, and his leadership was never disputed, so it couldn't have been that alone. There was something else going on, and the something else going on was they both wanted to be leaders, and their two personalities were just too big to be in the same room. Now, Jihadi-Salafis at one point joined the contest. Quietist Salafis and Jihadi-Salafis have vilified each other since at least the early 1990s, at least since 1993. And Jihadis accused quietists of being Murji'a. Vice versa, the quietists accused the jihadis of being Khawarij. That was a very, it's almost like theological mudslinging. I mean, you can't call each other a kafir, you can't call each other an unbeliever, because clearly all of these people are Muslims. That's clear to all. But the effectiveness, you shouldn't underestimate the effectiveness of these labels, because no one is saying that the Murji'a were not Muslims. They were Muslims. They were deviant Muslims, but Muslims nevertheless. The Khawarij too, they were Muslims. But if you can use a theologically complicated label to say, okay, you may be a Muslim, but you're a Khariji, or you're a Murji'i, that is a very sophisticated way of calling someone a name, of decredentializing and vilifying someone, because it's very hard to disprove, because you need to read all that theological stuff, and it sticks to you, and nobody wants to be called a Khariji or a Murji'i. So it's a very effective and difficult to counter way of vilifying someone. And you can imagine, of course, that the jihadis, they looked at this debate going on that I just said, and said, right, so even quietists are calling Ali al-Halabi a Murji'i. Now we can use their arguments too. So what you saw was that Jihadi-Salafis started using the fatwa from the Permanent Council in Saudi Arabia to see, even they are saying it. They're supposed to be on your side, and even they're saying it. So what about, I mean, obviously you have to believe us now. So the Shaqra-Halabi conflict that I just described gave a boost to this entire conflict. Shaqra eventually even sided with the so-called Khariji jihadis, and that made it easier for the quietists to vilify him as well, because Shaqra was seen as a non-Murji'i, but he sided with the Jihadi-Salafis. So Ali al-Halabi could say, see, we said that he had deviant theological views. Look at who he is associating with now. He's sitting in the mosques with Jihadi-Salafis. And this is actually how they said it to me. They're associating with Jihadi-Salafis, with Takfiris, with Kharijis. They're sitting there hobnobbing with these guys. Look at what they're doing. The Kharijis, he's a Khariji. It's a good thing we kicked him out. Look at his views. So the involvement of the Jihadi-Salafis reinforced the theological boundaries between these two groups, which was really all about the leadership. But the theological dimension started taking on a life of its own. And this is very clear when you look at the international jihadis getting involved. The international jihadis did not know this context that I've just given you. This was a very Jordanian thing, and I would even argue it's very much something that took place in Amman. Even if you go to places in Jordan outside Amman, many people will not know this. Many people will not know about these leadership contexts. They only read and hear about the theological arguments. But the international Jihadi-Salafis never knew anything about this. They just thought, oh, there's a theological debate going on, and they use theological arguments. So they started taking this leadership debate out of its Jordanian context and thinking it's only about theology. Now, that is not the only problem of religious authority, because the Jihadi-Salafis have a religious authority problem of their own as well. Namely, Al-Maqdisi. Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi is a Jihadi Salafi scholar. He's a radical scholar in his own right. Nevertheless, he has also criticized jihadis. He has said, you are using random violence, you are committing atrocities, you are beheading people, you are doing suicide bombings in churches and on buses and in mosques, even Shiite mosques. He said, Shiites, okay, their beliefs may be deviant, but the average Shiite, for them, Islam is just praying, fasting, going to the mosque. There's nothing wrong with them. You shouldn't just kill them. And he said there's no planning, and he particularly aimed this criticism at his former pupil, Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi was known as the first leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That was one of his most important pupils in Jordan. He was Jordanian himself. So, despite the fact that al-Maqdisi was a radical scholar, he also criticized jihadis. But al-Zarqawi supporters responded to this. They said, well, that's all fine and good that you're trying to criticize al-Zarqawi, but you are criticizing him from behind your computer in your comfortable living room, while al-Zarqawi is actually fighting a jihad against the Americans in Iraq. So while al-Zarqawi is dodging the bullets, you are criticizing him. Why do you do that? that shows that you have a wrong character. You, sir, are a bookish scholar. You know nothing about jihad. You've never dodged the bullets. There was one person on a jihad forum at the time who said, Al-Maqdisi, despite the fact that he's Palestinian, has never even thrown so much as a stone at the Zionists. So Az-Zarqawi is out there doing his jihadi duty according to the standards of these people. And here is Al-Maqdisi, who, according to his own admission, he's even told me this himself, is not a fighter. He's never fought in any jihad. Yet he's criticizing Zarqawi. So Zarqawi's supporters did not take this very lightly, and they criticized him for that. They said, you have no right to criticize Zarqawi because you have no experience as a fighter yourself. That was the core of their argument. So Al-Maqdisi obviously had to respond to that, and he vilified his critics as well. Now what did he say? Did he say, well, you're right, I never fought a jihad, but according to the rules, what Az-Zarqawi is doing is wrong? No, he didn't say that. He said, you are Khawarij. So just like the previous group, he was using theology as a front to cover up the real motives, i.e. his own lack of jihadi credentials. He was criticized for not having fought in a jihad, and in response he didn't say, oh no, I did fight in a jihad. That would have been a lie. And he didn't even admit the truth. No, what he said was, you are extremists in ideology. You are extremists just like the Khawarij were. You are extremists in takfir. So he was accusing them of having the wrong knowledge. And just like some of the quietist Salafis that I just talked about, they covered up the real conflict about religious authority, in this case jihadi authority, fighting authority, by putting a theological veneer over it, by framing it in theological terms. And obviously, I didn't include this here, but obviously his opponents responded by saying, why are you saying this? We're not disputing that you're a greater scholar than we are. We're just saying that you never fought a jihad. So they responded by this. And Al-Maqdisi, I think he also responded in ideological terms because he knew he would be comfortable with those. He knew he could counter their ideas in ideological terms. In practical terms, that would have been very difficult because he knew that they were right. So, concluding this, we shouldn't forget that theology and ideology is very important in debates about Salafis. That's just true. Salafis are very, very strict about their ideas, and theology and ideology is just very important. I'm not denying that at all. Certainly not as someone who spends most of his time dealing with ideology. I would not deny the importance of this at all. But theology can and was also used as a front by Jordanian Salafis to cover up the real conflict that was going on between them, which was really about the leadership in the case of Ali al-Halabi and Muhammad Ibrahim Shaqla on the one hand, and a jihadi deficit, as I call it, in the case of Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi. So that means that things like ambition and leadership and even vanity play a role among Salafis too, which, and the conclusion of the conclusion is that Salafis are quite human. Thank you.